Dear viewers, my name is Sirandao. I am a member of the African Network Against Extrajudicial Killings and Enforced Disappearances, ANAKED. ANAKED advocates for victims of extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances. We are present in the Gambia with projects around the transitional justice process, as well as have activities in Ghana around the same area. We are back here today to talk about part 2 of the National Dialogue on Forgiveness, Accountability and Healing. The National Dialogue is a 4-part series of discussions where we're engaging pertinent stakeholders in the transitional justice process in the Gambia, such as the UN system, Ministry of Justice and the TRRC. We are also engaging religious experts, psychosocial specialists, academia, as well as victims in starting the very important discussions to talk about life post-TRRC. In part 2 today, we'll be talking about forgiveness, history and healing. Like we mentioned the last time, we believe that our history, our context is very important in what happened here in the 22 years of Yahya Jammeh's dictatorial rule. We will explore our history in terms of forgiveness, and we will also talk to our psychosocial specialist to tell us more about healing, what it entails and how it works. We first start down with Madam Aissa today, the UNDP resident representative in the Gambia, to ask her about UNDP's role in the transitional justice process as well as what their expectations are. Madam Day, thank you for sitting with us today. Can you tell us a little bit more about UNDP's role in the transitional justice process?
Thank you. I'm very delighted to have this conversation because the transitional justice process is at the heart of the restarting of a new Gambia, what the new Gambia that the Gambian wants. And UNDP, as in many countries, have been involved in the transitional justice processes because of the linkages between peace and development. Because you cannot have development without having social cohesion and having peace. And in this journey, we are not alone. All our engagement in the transitional justice process is done together with the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, because they are the guardians of the standards when it comes to implementation of those mechanisms, because the transitional justice mechanisms are not limited to the TRRC itself. It's one of the mechanisms. And in the Gambia, the TRRC has set a level that we did not really see in many countries in terms of openness, in terms of access to the information, because I think that this is the first time, at least in the recent history in Africa, where we can have public hearings that are translated into almost all local languages and known nationwide with the full participation and engagement. And UNDP supporting that has been fundamental, and it's why we have been here since day one, together with the Office of the High Commissioner, but also together with the government to make sure that the mechanisms that are part of the transitional justice process are put in place and up and running. So our intervention came in several manners, but mainly technical expertise. Technical expertise that we brought from external, but at the same time building up national technical expertise in the different area of intervention of the mechanism, to make sure that we are building also capacities to run the process by the Gambian, because it's first of all owned by the Gambians. So this is why UNDP has been a key player in this process. And I was telling about the interlinkages with the development, because UNDP has one of the main pillars of its mandate is related to governance. And governance, and then you have the linkages with other pillars, which are poverty reduction and sustainable growth and environment. So, and during all the process that we've seen how this process, the TRRC, it has impacted the eagerness of Gambian for accountability. I think the Gambia post-TRRC will not be the same than the Gambia before TRRC.
Thank you very much, Madam Day. We would also like to know, what are your expectations? What is UNDP's expectations in terms of post-TRRC? And also, what plans do you have in preparing for life after TRRC?
The main expectation, as I mentioned earlier, is first of all the ownership, to make sure that it's a mechanism, is a process that has an impact in enhancing and fostering and nurturing social cohesion. The TRRC itself as a commission is one of the mechanisms. But now our expectation is to really see beyond the ownership that the Gambian has already shown, to see what will be coming out as recommendation and how those recommendations will be implemented. And I think it's a common expectation with many stakeholders. And this is where really we will need a lot of involvement and inclusiveness in the step forward for the process. When you come to transitional justice processes, the term justice is part of it, is the heart of the process, because there are some crimes will need to be addressed, and now the mechanism to address those crimes, whatever number of years it will take, can differ from one country to another. Each mechanism is tailored with the reality of the country, so it's for the Gambian, and based on the recommendation that will come out from the process, to really see what is the most suitable mechanism for them. But it's likely that the mechanism that will follow will be really something that is also very own with national, by the Gambian in terms of processes. So what we are doing now in the preparedness for the post-TRRC, while we are waiting for the recommendation, because we don't have yet the report, is to see how we are looking at the judiciary. UNDP has a rule of law program to support the rule of law reform in the Gambia, and we've been working very closely with the judiciary. And for instance, just to give you an example, during this pandemic period, where all our institutions, all the Gambian institutions has been impacted, we help the judiciary to set up virtual courts, because the Gambia cannot afford to have cases piling while they already have a huge backlog. So what we did was to support the setting of the virtual court. There are 2 of them, and they are being expanded. And Gambia is even being mentioned as an example, because we've been asked by one of the neighboring countries in the sub-region to come and learn about the experience of the virtual court in the Gambia. So this court has helped to reduce some caseload and address some cases, so that they are not they are cleared while the pandemic is going on. So what we are trying to do is to see how we can invest on training, because there are certain type of crimes that the Gambian judge who might be involved in addressing them after the TRRC are not familiar with. We are talking about torture, we are talking about disappearance, we are talking about very horrible crimes that the judges have never had maybe experience to address. So they will need, we are trying to see how, together with the Chief Justice and his team, to invest in this area. But at the same time also we know that the judiciary has been one of the institutions that have been very much affected by the 22 years period that the Gambia went through, in terms of not only capacity, but also in terms of even working conditions. So what we are trying to do also has been to invest on it, to have the system more digitalized, to invest on the training, and to make sure that the judiciary will be up and running once the TRRC will finalize its mandate. So it has really been a very important journey, because rule of law also is at the heart of our intervention, and all we are doing in this area are done together with the National Human Rights, with the Office of the High Commissioner, because the fact that the Gambia has now a national mechanism to promote and protect human rights, and as a permanent body, is also very important, because we've seen recently how the National Commission of Human Rights, which is an independent institution, it's an independent body, has taken a stand and will play its full role in the process. And the fact that the African Human Rights Commission is hosted in the Gambia is also very, very important to bear in mind, so that Gambia will be an example of human rights, instead of once they will also address all the past, because it's really through a look on in the past that we can really the Gambia will engage in a better future. We are already engaging a lot through the peace building funded project on enhancing dialogue among the political actors, we have also the intergenerational dialogue, but at the same time we want to all these processes that we are talking about, we don't want them to be upstream processes. We want the processes to be owned. It's important for the population to know that these are processes that they own, they are part of. And to ensure this inclusiveness, we went throughout and we have a dedicated program, and now we also are engaging on the electoral process. What is important is to really understand that these are not standalone processes. They are interlinked, they are part of the development agenda, and they are also, and then the development agenda is part of what we call the nexus. In countries like the Gambia, where we are in a transition, there's a tight linkages between peace and development. We are glad that you are interested in, so that you can take it to take the message to the whole communities for them to understand what are the challenges and how the UN and the UNDP are supporting the Gambia and the Gambians. And we are also partnering with the university, and we just initiated a partnership with the university to make sure that the student who will be the leader for tomorrow can be more involved in this type of processes, and we hope that next time it will be with them that we will do the national tour wide and work together on the post-TRRC as well, because they will have the role to play in transmitting the message to the younger generation that is already looking up to them, because they will be the one that will be the next leaders. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Madam
Thank
Day.
you. Thank you so much. Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you. And you stay well.
We also received a video intervention from OHCHR's regional representative for West Africa in Senegal, Mr. Andre Ori.
Thank you, and thank you for asking us to intervene and present the work of OHCHR during the transition in countries where from conflict or authoritarian rule moved to democracy. And indeed, in the Gambia, OHCHR has always been present and working with a civil society organization, the government in upholding human rights, in the promotion and protection of human rights. So that it was even more important that after the election in December, OHCHR was present in the Gambia in monitoring the human rights situation in the context of elections, and we followed up on all the transition and the establishment of the new government. In the beginning, we offered the technical assistance and advice to the government and the then Minister of Justice to establish a thorough transitional justice process. And he accompanied as well the Minister of Justice in the study tour in different countries, in particular in South Africa, just to have a grasp of lesson learned, best practice from other countries that they went through the same experience. So that is, important how OHCHR has been accompanying, the government and the state authority in establishing a thorough system to ensure accountability and serve justice, promote truth and memory about past violations, and also provide, remedies to victims. So our approach and our advice to the Minister of Justice and to the government has always been, the approach of victim centers, inclusions of all the different national stakeholders. Victims, had to be at the center of the conversation, and we guaranteed and provide, technical advice, financial support in what was the first stage of the very national consultations in ensure social cohesion and nation building ownership and inclusion of all national levels. And one of the key requests that was given to the United Nations, OHCHR, was indeed human rights. All parties that were talking about human rights, reconciliations, justice, no peace without justice. So that is the key intervention that we had during let's say the first phase, and as OHCHR has been supporting national authority, state institutions in providing this kind of mechanism that is known as the TRRC. So the expectation that we have as OHCHR on the post-TRRC are indeed mainly that individuals that have been found that have violated gross violation of human rights or serious violation of international humanitarian law are actually facing justice, justice that it can go through different forms and shapes, but it shouldn't just be reinstated or into a position without going through a thorough checks on their what they did in the past, and they should be in a certain way and according to the modalities that are please the Gambia and the people of the Gambia. They should be one of those. In particular, our expectation on the post-TRRC is that the recommendations stemming out of the old process and these years are actually implemented, and this implementation should be in a way that it takes into account what we call it the international standards, international principles, and in particular looking at remedies for victims, as often in times, and we have seen in the past experiences, those recommendations are actually not thoroughly implemented, and victims of human rights violations or international humanitarian law are actually still seeking justice, and victims of those violations are looking for remedies to heal their what has been done to them. So it's and the remedies can be of different forms or shapes, and the common approach would be collective remedies and providing any type of assistance, going from psychological assistance because of those traumas. They are long-lasting in time, but also the survivors and also the family or the relatives of the victims should be taken into consideration on the programs for the post-TRC in terms of medical care, as I said, and psychological care, and also assistance in education, free education, and so on. So all different type of process that we can envisage as a support to them. But justice should be one of the elements and the cornerstones of the new Gambia, where what we are building on the main pillars for a democratic states based on rule of law, on justice, and those perpetrators of gross human rights violation and violation of international humanitarian law are actually somehow in a different forms and shapes, but being held accountable and should be held responsible for what actually occurred. So those are the main elements. What are the plans for us to prepare for the post-TRC is indeed to continue supporting the national stakeholders, mainly civil society organizations, the victim centers, or any organization that works on transitional justice or the post-transitional justice, and in particular supporting government authority, the state institutions, in ensuring that we prevent the recurrence of the crisis and future violation of human rights. So we should learn from the past, looking at the recommendation from the TRC to avoid that this is going to happen again in the country, and in particular looking at the different recommendations from the TRC in the reform of the state institutions, in the reform in the state laws and legislation, to avoid the recurrence of such a dramatic experience that generations went through that. And it should be, part of the healing process for ensuring social cohesion, nation building around, human rights principles and the rule of law. So our plan indeed is looking at the national institutions, and now we have, the newly, although it's not new nowadays, national human rights commissions, and working with them in making sure that the prevention of human rights violation is not recurring, the promotion of a culture of human rights and the respect for basic human rights freedoms. So OHCHR stands ready in continuing working together with the different national, international stakeholders, mainly state authorities, civil society organization, in particular with the National Human Rights Institution. So we are together in this, and only together we can move on and provide a sustainable and durable solution for democratic New Gambia. Thank you once again, and I wish you, a very bright future to all of you, and in particular to the young generation, young ladies and women, and generation that they are going to be, the making proud of the Gambia. Once again, and I'm looking forward to continue working with all of you on this, and thank you.
Next, we sat down with Said Matijau, lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the University of the Gambia, UTG. Mr. Jau told us more about the history of forgiveness in the context of our Gambian history. What is the history of human rights violations in the Gambia, and has forgiveness played a role in it?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. For me personally, if I want to situate the history of human rights violation in this country, I'll trace it back to the colonial history, where this country was divided into the colony and protectorate, where the colony was more what Mamdani will call the citizens and the protectorates were subjects. And so in that process, the traditional authority was used by the colonialists, as a means to violate people's rights and all that. And so this continued through, because the same institutions that we inherited from colonialism is the same institution. Even currently, when we're talking about the Police Act of 1958, we can trace it back to the colonial history. But for me, then 1981, there were certain issues, especially after the failed coup, and then from 1994 is the most recent and contemporary period where people have talked about the range of violations that were committed by the Yahya Jammeh regime. And so if you look at it from 1981 then to now in particular, then you know that in terms of forgiveness, Gambians have always been very forgiving. Like somebody will tell me that after the 1981 coup, it seems like the whole country end up becoming together because of the mechanism that was instituted, like the Gambia Tribunal, which was the first hybrid court in Africa. So I think after the Nuremberg, of course, I think that has kind of supported our understanding. But forgiveness and reconciliation, these are social issues. These are issues that are embedded within the religious scripts. These are embedded within the cultural settings. And historically, people will tell you if you did something to a family, they will end up taking, they prefer not to take you to police because they wanted to settle that through the traditional means. So I think they've been here, there were violations, but also people had their own local mechanism that they were trying to use to ensure that those violations were not pronounced.
So moving on, when can we talk about the probability of recurrence of human rights violations in a society where forgiveness is prevalent, like you had mentioned earlier, that forgiveness is embedded into our cultural norms and our way of life and traced it back to colonial structures?
Yes.
What really is the probability of recurrence when you have a society where forgiveness is prevalent?
Like sometimes some of us historians will say people do not really learn from history. One event can happen, but then it can, repeat itself because, sometimes people say it is part of human existence that there is violence, there is all those different elements. And so therefore there is also forgiveness and also there is all those different issues. But a society that doesn't learn from its past will always repeat that past. And I think for us also at this minute, we do not tend to learn a lot from our history, and that's why today sometimes you see that some of the violations that we are talking about under the Jammeh regime, we are also experiencing under Barrow, which promised a very new and democratic society, like issues of police brutality. You remember I talked about the 1958 Colonial Act, and it's the same act that still exists and governs the way we do. So, I mean, as long as these legal institutions exist, of course, we may see violence recurring.
So what can we say about forgiveness, the role of forgiveness in prevalence of human rights violation in our context, in the history? Is it something that we are seeing that it's pushing it further, not necessarily preventing the human rights violation, but perpetuating it in a sense?
I think forgiveness must be understood from a context. What happened in 1981 is different from what happened in 1984. 1981 was more of a coup, civilian-led coup, and there was resistance. So at the end of the day, those that attacked the state was resisted and captured, and they faced the law because they committed a crime. So if you force with forgiveness, you must accept what you have done. And I think for me that should be the way, that you have accept what you have done, and then people will look at that and see whether they can forgive you in that perspective or otherwise. Because then we must also, when we are discussing these terms, also we need to know the intergenerational differences. People today are not very forgiving like the older generation, for instance. So I think context also is important, but generally I think it's part of us, it's part of the religion, but it must be based on the facts, it must be based on genuinity. And because at the end of the day, it's about moving from this stage and then pushing to that. And so I think it will always be here as long as people continue to be Muslims and Christians as well.
Wow, that's an interesting. And that we will continue to face human rights violations because of our ways,
not the human rights violation, but I'm saying in terms of the context.
The context.
But there is a likelihood, if people do not learn from history of the violations that happen, and if we do not, in terms of learning that lesson, we are talking about whether it was the legal framework. I like to use the Police Act all the time because it shows from colonialism what the police were meant for is still the same function that the police are meant for. If the police were established to subjugate people during the colonial period and still does the same process, we'll expect that will still continue. But then in terms of the forgiveness and all that there is no national framework for that. But this is more embedded on the social relationship and the individual ways that people interact. But these are elements that could be adopted because, of course, in the social environment, there are traditional leaders, whether it is the chiefs, whether it is the imam or the pastor. These are people that work within the society and then bringing people together and all that. So these are elements that could be adopted in the government level, but then there must be accountability. And if there is accountability and then you accepted that you have done something that is wrong, then I believe that will not reoccur. But as long as in terms of the structural institutions, we still continue to have the legal framework, of course, you cannot say it will not happen, that the police will not beat people. What is the legal framework to say don't beat people,
Thank you very much, Mr. Said Matijau, for elaborating on the historical context of human rights violation in the Gambia, and particularly for really taking us back and bringing the connection between the colonial and the structural, showing us really where we need to be and the element of forgiveness that has impacted us in our country. Thank you very much. Finally, we sat down with Guy Masise and Jackie Charles of the Organization for Psychosocial Innovation, OPI, to learn more about healing and what it entails. How does healing look like, and what is the psychological impact on victims in the context of forgiveness and forgiving?
So what healing actually is the individual being able to live their life without the thoughts of the trauma, the feelings and the distress they used to feel interfering with their life. So they're able to undergo relational interactions, they're able to live their lives, they're able to also not be triggered by anything that reminds them of the trauma. So for example, somebody who was probably tortured and the person who was torturing them wore red outfits. So maybe after the post-trauma, whenever they see red, they're constantly triggered, they're afraid to go to certain places. But once that person starts to heal, when they see red, they're able to use healthy coping skills, healthy coping strategies without it triggering them. Also, they're able to go places, not avoid people, not avoid anything that reminds them of the trauma, because they've learned how to deal with it and they've accepted it as well. So when we talk about healing and forgiveness, they actually kind of go hand in hand. Almost, they're not mutually exclusive. So when we say forgiveness or when we say healing, it's almost hard to completely heal or to be on that process of healing if you have not forgiven, because when you've not forgiven, you're still holding on to the anger, to the bitterness, to the resentment that you felt, and because of that, it's actually hard to heal, because then you're still in the trauma, you're still living in the trauma, so you still remember the things that happened to you, you still remember how it made you feel, you still think about the perpetrator and what the perpetrator did to you, and that makes it hard for you to heal. So for you to heal, forgiveness is actually a vital part of healing, because forgiveness is you letting go of all the anger and the resentment that has really put you in that state of trauma. So without forgiveness, healing is actually very hard.
What is the psychological impact of forced forgiveness on the healing process of victims?
It's important to know what forgiveness is not. So forgiveness is not the individual, the survivor, actually saying that what happened to them was okay. It doesn't mean that they have to become best friends with the survivor, with the perpetrator. It doesn't mean that they're condoning what happened to them, they're accepting what happened to them. So most of the time when you tell somebody forgive your perpetrator, they think it's, oh, now I have to be okay with this person. What happened to me, I'm saying it's acceptable. No, we're not saying that. Forgiveness, what forgiveness really is, like I said before, it's kind of like a reflective process, an internal process where you look into yourself, you try to feel that anger that you had or that you have, the resentment, all the negative feelings that you have, and let it go. So it has more to do with an internal process and you and what you feel versus as opposed to what you or how you see your trauma and how you see the other person. So it's an internal process that has to do with freeing yourself that will help you to heal. So when we talk about forced forgiveness, it's actually something that does not help in the healing process, because forgiveness is actually something that has to happen naturally. We all, when people experience trauma, we've all experienced a time when somebody has done something wrong to us and we had to forgive them, even if it's just for minor offenses. But we take our time to forgive people. Everybody has their own timeline with which they follow to actually forgive somebody. So when we talk about trauma, we don't force people to forgive, because then the person has not really dealt with their issues, with their anger, with their bitterness, with their resentment, and they need that time to actually deal with that. So when they are forced to forgive, the anger becomes internalized, it becomes suppressed, and it actually only leads to more anxiety, more depression, and they really get stuck in that space, and because of that, the healing actually is hindered. So it's very important that when we tell people when we ask people to forgive, or at least when we're advise people to forgive, we don't tell them you have to forgive this person now. You tell them that when you forgive, it's good for you and for your healing process, but take your time. Forgive in your own time. as opposed to, oh, you have to forgive now. We have to allow people to go through the healing process naturally, to, you know, go through their thoughts and how they feel and decide that, okay, now I want to let go and I want to actually heal.
So also in the context of forgiveness, because it is such an individual process, and the process is also dependent on the violation or what the person has experienced, that also they're often sometimes different prerequisites for the person in the healing and forgiveness process. So for example, in some cases, a person feels that an important part would be restitution. They would need some sort of compensation in terms of the violation they went through, and to restore back to them what was taken. And in some cases, the person doesn't require that. I think in my experience in working with people on a forgiving process, the difficulty when the person feels that there's a restitution required in order for their forgiveness or their healing to happen, is that often that restitution relies on an external power or an external process to their internal process, and that often creates huge barriers. So if we're thinking about, you know, commissions where there are things like reparations, land restoration, that if we have to wait for that, it becomes sometimes a huge barrier to someone being able to forgive what happened to them, because it's reliant on a government or another process to provide that. And so you have to try find the balance of helping the person accept if these are things that cannot be provided to you. How do we help you forgive and heal? Because of what is in your control, because of that anger and resentment that Ngaima was talking about, that really strongly only affects the individual. The perpetrator or the government responsible doesn't feel that anger and resentment on a day-to-day basis and experience all the hindrances to their day-to-day functioning. So then it's also trying to help people see about what is important for them in their forgiveness and healing process, that they have control over. And it's not about saying that you don't need an acknowledgement, because that is also an incredibly important part of a forgiveness and healing process, is a perpetrator acknowledging what has been done, remorse related to that. So it's not about, okay, well, it happened, I don't have all the answers, I must forgive. Finding the answers, having perpetrators are also an incredibly important part in the process for people.
What is the probability of recurrence of human rights violations in a society where forgiveness is prevalent?
So when we talk about forgiveness as it being a true forgiveness that the individual or the family has chosen, and not a forced forgiveness because of a societal pressure or religious pressure that says we must just forgive and move on. So when it is true forgiveness, then it really does help promote and prevent recurrence of the same things happening. Because when we think about the anger, the resentment that, and I know we'll speak a bit more about then the act for the revenge and the need for revenge, that those are the strong feelings that drive that. And so you will find small incidences where that anger and that is re-triggered and brought out. Very often if you think about an oppressed group or an oppressed person, that those are very easily at the surface. And so that's why in many contexts and ways we talk about a cycle of violence that just continues and perpetuates itself, because a country or a people or an individual have not had the opportunity to experience proper forgiveness that was determined by themselves, and individual and collective healing. So in contexts where there is the proper processes put in place, the proper access to things that promote a forgiving and a healing process, you will find in the future the probability of recurrence is much less. But where we don't put those systems in place and we don't have those things accessible to the people that were affected, we find that the probability of recurrence is much higher, and that's why we see even a lot of transitional justice processes, 10, 5, 15 years later, you have a resurgence of a different type of violence or oppression that happens.
And it's also important to note that reconciliation is not synonymous to forgiveness, because most of the time when we talk about reconciliation, people expect that the survivor or the victim has to forgive, the perpetrator. But reconciliation can be part of forgiveness, but it doesn't have to happen together. So when we talk about preventing reoccurrence and we say we want to reconcile because we assume that reconciling is actually going to bring peace and everything is going to be okay, we have to understand that we cannot force people to reconcile. And when people reconcile, it doesn't mean that they have forgiven. So you can do reconciliation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that forgiveness has happened as well.
Is there a role for revenge in the healing process and psychological well-being for survivors or victims of human rights violations?
So for many people, their answer would be yes, that if I was to be able to revenge what happened, if I could hurt the person that did this to me, if I could enact the same thing to somebody else that was done to me, it becomes an immediate sense of justice in the short term, but in the long term it doesn't contribute to the person's healing and can actually cause longer term psychological impacts and effects. And then it also becomes a thing that continues a revenge cycle and continues a cycle where the same rights are violated, the same crimes are perpetrated, where people continuously feel a need to perpetrate as a means of then becoming as a way of getting their power back. And so that is also then the huge contributing factor to recurrence, because it becomes where we talk about the oppressor becoming the oppressed and the oppressed becoming the oppressor, because we then enact it in different ways in order to try obtain our power. And revenge is one of those ways that people do it, but it doesn't help in a person's healing process at all, and only creates a short-term kind of very short-term sense of satisfaction, but often more guilt and blame in the aftermath of it.
This brings us to the end of part 2 of the National Dialogue on Forgiveness, Accountability and Healing. We've been talking about forgiveness, history and healing, and we hope that this brings us closer to being on the same page as we proceed on the transitional justice process in the Gambia. I thank you all.